Welcome everyone to Unit Masters. It's the fifth cohort of Unit Masters 6 weeks online training, free for everyone. And today we have the first live speaking session, and it's with Keir Finlow-Bates, who has an incredible reputation in the ecosystem to be a person with a lot of humor, taking like a lot of humility while he has done a lot of amazing work, creating a lot of patents, writing a book, which he will hopefully share about later on, and giving us a fairly high level systemic overview of the evolution of the internet and all the major principles of what we call the new economy at Unit. So here, I want to hand over the microphone to you, mute myself, and let you run your show. Thanks for being with us.
Okay. So, hi everybody. Thanks very much for inviting me, Yib. And I've started walking. So those of you who are familiar with some of my work will know that I make a lot of videos where I walk through these woods in Finland and talk about blockchain and Bitcoin and things like that. Yib asked me to start off with talking a bit about who I am and what I'm passionate about. And I responded that, well, first I'd really like to know the makeup of the audience. And in fact, I can read out her answer here. The audience is global and of diverse backgrounds and from all walks of life. So that's quite a tricky crowd to pitch a talk at. Fortunately, I happen to have a trick up my sleeve, which is that one of the things that I do is I pick a topic and I actually try to drill down and understand at a very basic fundamental level what it's about. And I found personally in my life that when I do that, I end up with a much deeper understanding of what's going on than if you read pages and pages out of a textbook. I think Einstein said you should make everything as simple as possible, but no simpler than that. And so hopefully that's the tightrope that I'm going to walk today in talking about Web 3.0. So a bit about myself. Well, I did a mathematics degree at Cambridge, and then I did a PhD in mathematics and education at South Bank University in London. I was a maths lecturer for 1 year before I gave up on academia and then moved into the computer software industry. And I've been there ever since, so it's now 25 years and counting. And I first came across Bitcoin and therefore blockchain either at the end of 2009 or the beginning of 2010. I can't really remember exactly when, but I do know that it was winter at the time because there was a lot of snow outside. So in Finland, that kind of narrows it down to a window of about 4 to 5 months. And in 2015, the company I was working for had a series of layoffs. And at that point, I started my own company called Chainfrog to research blockchain and see if I could launch a successful product. So I managed the first one, but unfortunately the second one, a successful product, has eluded me so far. And what else about me? Well, I like creating stuff, so I'm a bit of an inventor. And at the moment, I'm a named inventor on, I think it's 44 patents at the moment, of which 14 or 15 are blockchain related patents. So there's that area too. And I think I'll kind of wrap up talking about myself now, because although you've said that 10 minutes would be a suitable allotted time, that seems a bit overly generous to me. It's meant to be about Web 3.0 and not about me. So one thing I do want to raise before I start talking about Web 3.0 is just a moment to plug my book. It's called Move Over Brokers. Here Comes the Blockchain. It came out in December last year. And for those of you who are interested in understanding a bit more about the sort of foundational background technology that enables all the stuff that I'm going to talk about today, because I'm not going to dive into blockchain in depth. I really recommend this book, and it's not just me who recommends it. There's quite a number of testimonials and reviews out there. It does the same thing that I try to do in my talks, which is it attempts to appeal to all levels of the audience. And from what people have said about it, it does seem to hit the mark. I've had people who have absolutely no technical training whatsoever, come back to me and say, thanks for that. That's really clear and I have a much better idea what's going on now. And I've had people who have been working in programming smart contracts for the last 5 years also come back to me and say they got useful stuff out of it. So maybe you will put a link to it later, or you can find me on LinkedIn, and then there are links to this there too. I have a totally unique name, so you can just search for Keir Finlow-Bates and you'll find me. Anyway, so that's enough about me, and I'm going to toss that into the forest there for somebody else to pick up. What's the topic of the day? Well, as I mentioned a couple of times, I'm going to be talking about Web 3.0 and what it is, and I'm going to look at it partially from a technical point of view, but also I'm going to be looking at some of the social and philosophical and psychological issues surrounding Web 3.0, because a technology is, maybe something that sits there running on a machine, but the fact is that we create technologies for human beings, and therefore you actually have to take into account what it is that drives people in order to talk meaningfully about these kind of things. So to start at the very beginning, Web 3.0, well, that implies that there's a Web 2.0 and a Web 1.0. So we'll move on to a little bit of a history lesson here. And back in the late 80s, when people like Madonna and Bruce Springsteen were topping the charts, a guy called Tim Berners-Lee invented something that he called the World Wide Web. And in its first instance, it was a very one-directional technology. You had web servers that stored documents, say academic papers, and then you had web browsers that people would use in order to retrieve those documents and look at them. So Web 1.0 is a bit like going to a library and taking out a book or reading a newspaper. You've got content providers and you have content consumers. And in fact, back in the early 90s, I'm just going to turn around because I think the wind may be blowing a bit badly here. Back in the early 90s, I actually saw one of the first web browsers as a PhD student. It was called Mosaic, and to be honest, at the time, I was not particularly impressed. It was this gray application with a gray web page. The web pages that I saw, well, the first one had a picture of a guy who could have been someone who was sitting next to me in maths lectures as an undergraduate. And it said on the page, "Hi, I'm John Smith, and here are some links to other pages of my friends." And when you clicked on one of those links, you went to an almost identical looking page with pictures of another guy and another list of his friends. So not particularly overwhelming. And like a lot of people at the time, I looked at it and said, well, that's interesting, and then moved on. But fortunately, people started picking up on the fact that this technology might actually have something to offer the world. And when you think about it, my kids are, of course, like all kids, totally immersed in the internet and web culture. And quite frankly, they find the thought that I was born and was a kid before the internet and before the World Wide Web, that makes me something of a dinosaur. As far as they're concerned, living in a world without the web is like living in a world without motor cars or houses or things like that. So it's really become a key part of our experience in life. So I've covered Web 1.0, one-directional content providers, content consumers, and you needed to have quite a lot of technological knowledge in order to set up a web server at that time. It wasn't a trivial activity to engage in. And in fact, as a result, you saw that initially a lot of the web servers were being run in universities on university computers that had IP addresses, and the general public couldn't really participate. Now, this changed with Web.2, and I looked up references that I could find on when this idea of Web 2.0 was actually coined. And it was coined, let me see if I can find her name, Darcy DiNucci in 1999 was the first reference I could find to Web 2.0. And actually then O'Reilly put on a conference in 2004 where they talked about Web 2.0. And the big shift there, well, actually, there were several big shifts. The first major one was that instead of it being content providers and content consumers, you started seeing websites where ordinary people could create user accounts and log on, and more importantly, could actually create content on the websites that they were seeing. So we're seeing things like social media, MySpace, and then Facebook, LiveJournal, maybe some of you remember that, Twitter. More interactiveness between the people behind the web browsers and the people setting up the web servers. So that was really quite a big leap forward in the usefulness of the World Wide Web. To take an example, a classic example would be Wikipedia. If you take encyclopedias in the past, you would have to go and do a degree in literature or history or English at Oxford University, and then get hired by the Encyclopedia Britannica, write articles for the encyclopedia, and then they would get bound in a book and published and put on a shelf in a library and then hardly read by anybody. And now we have something like Wikipedia, which means that if you are a car repairman who happens to have a fascination with 1967 Chevy Impalas, or if you're some guy who has become an amateur expert on mushrooms in Lapland or something crazy like that, you can go to Wikipedia and you can write an entry or an article for the encyclopedia, and it will actually get published. And that's quite a shift in the sort of control and flow of power, I suppose, in the dissemination of information. So, as I said, Web 2.0, I think I had a definition, Internet of Interaction. But the issue with Web 2.0 is that it's still, to a certain extent, centralized. You have companies like Facebook or Twitter, and they control the servers. And although they let you participate, there's nothing guaranteeing that next week or next month or next year, your account will still be there and you'll still be able to join in with all the fun. So there's a bit of a flaw there. And the other thing is that although we saw companies like Amazon and eBay and that spring up to enable e-commerce, and those companies, interestingly enough, allow their customers to rank and rate products and product suppliers, for example. So there's your Web 2.0 interactiveness. They hit a stumbling block, which is payment. If you're going to have e-commerce, you need to be able to have a transaction. Somebody pays for something and gets something back in return. And this is one of the huge barriers that have to be overcome if you are going to operate a website that is actually going to enable commerce. And as an example, if you look at eBay, they actually went out and bought PayPal in order to handle payment processing. So, if you're a rich person and you have a need for a bank, you can go and buy one off the shelf, but that luxury is not available to the vast majority of us. So when you look at Web 2.0, one of the big stumbling blocks is enabling the possibility of payments and transactions. And this is where Web 3.0 comes in. Now, Tim Berners-Lee remember, he's the guy who invented the World Wide Web. He wanted to define Web 3.0 as something he called the semantic web. He thought it should be about moving on to the point where machines communicate with machines over the web and analyze the content automatically. So it's kind of machines starting to interpret meaning in things. However, for us lot, the definition that is of more interest is to actually think of it as the internet of value. That's the definition for Web 3.0 that, as far as I can tell, is starting to take off. And in order to understand why this is a significant leap, we're going to need to understand something about value. What does it mean for something to have value to people? Well, you can give a very simple example. An apple is something that has value to me because I can eat it and then I'm not hungry anymore. Or a house is something that can have value because I can live in it and I can take shelter from the weather. So that's useful to me too. Or another example, how about gold? Because, well, you see there we hit something odd. Now, gold does have utility like apples or houses, but that's not the primary purpose that we put it to. When you look at gold, about 10% of the gold in the world is used in the electronics industry because gold has a few useful properties for them. It's highly conductive and it doesn't corrode. So that's why they like using it in connectors and cables, for example. But one of the things that the electronics industry hates about gold is the fact that we as a species have decided to use it as a store of value. So the price of gold, if you put a dollar price on it, is much, much higher than it should be given its utility. And then the question is, well, why would we do such a thing? Why would we take a slightly soft, shiny yellow metal and say that it is more valuable than it really is when you look at what you can use it for? And actually, that is one of the amazing inventions of the human species, is that we have invented a method for storing value and then releasing it later on. And this is something that I think people in general don't really appreciate. When you know, we have a sort of gut feeling about the value of things when it comes to gold or money, but it's not really articulated particularly well. And maybe if what we can do is we can look at some of the properties of gold. What is it about it that makes it a good way to store value that can then be released later on? And some of the things are that it's instantly recognizable. It's a very distinctive colored metal. So secondly, the fact is that it's scarce, but it's not too scarce. If there was only a couple of 100 grams of gold on the planet, then we'd all have to be using microscopic tweezers in order to move atoms around to transact, and that's just not going to be practical. It occurs in its pure natural state, so you used to be able to walk around and find nuggets of it. Now, of course, we have to mine for it because we found most of the easy to find on the surface of the earth occurrences of it. And and there's a certain amount of effort that needs to be expended in order to gather it. So you need to do work in order to obtain it. And it's that working that is the mechanism that I believe allows it to store value. It's the reason why we don't use leaves that grow on trees as cash, because there's no work involved. I would be the world's richest person if we happen to use these leaves for money. Those of you who are fans of Douglas Adams and The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy will know there was a rather stupid species called the Golgafrinchians who tried precisely that. So gold falls neatly in, I guess it's called the Goldilocks zone of storing value. It's scarce, but not too scarce, and it takes some work in order to obtain it. And so in that sense, it's worked very well for a long, long time as a store of value. Then we've moved on to money or cash as a way of storing value. It's one of the uses. There are these three classical definitions in economics of what makes something money. It's meant to be a store of value, like I've just talked about. It's meant to be a unit of accounting so that you can put prices on things. That has some really handy properties in that bartering and trying to work out how many eggs you'd need to trade for some butter in order to then go and get a chicken from some other guy makes commerce really, really tricky. But if we can put prices on all those things, we only need a two-column table to keep track of how much everything is going to cost. So what did I have there? I had store of value, unit of accounting, and a medium of exchange. So the fact is you've not got to have a method whereby you can hand it over to somebody and get something back in return. It needs to enable transactions. So there's a quick, very basic economics lesson. And now what I want to talk a bit about is how cryptocurrencies manage to gather value. So Satoshi Nakamoto, he or she, we don't know which, published a paper in 2008 describing Bitcoin and inadvertently describing the first blockchain, which is the technical system underneath that allows computers to instantiate Bitcoins. And Bitcoins have a lot in common with gold in that they are scarce, but not too scarce. You can use them in an exchange, in a transaction, and there are units of them. In fact, you can even subdivide them down to 18 decimal places or something like that. I can't remember off the top of my head now, been working too much in Ethereum. So you have something that is in the digital world that has a clearly defined owner because it's recorded in a ledger on this blockchain that has a lot of the properties of money and gold. However, it has one significant advantageous property that cash or gold do not have, which is you can send it via email. Now, we moved from a bartering society to a society using money because although a house, like I gave as a previous example, has value, it's not very convenient to put one in your back pocket and take it down to the market in order to be able to buy some bread or something. That's why we came up with cash. Now there's a form of cash that has all the properties of money, but you can actually transact with it over the internet. So that's a really, really significant leap forward, because previously, if we wanted to have these kind of transactions, we needed to rely on a bank or a payment processor. So that's the PayPal example that I gave earlier. And now you have something that is like cash, but is online. And I can transact with you over the Bitcoin blockchain, or I can actually even put some Bitcoin into a transfer them to a Bitcoin address and send you the private key via email or text message, or I can even send it in a letter if I wanted to. And then as long as you transfer it out of that address, so I can't claw it back later, you now have that. So that's quite an amazing thing, the idea of being able to do transactions without relying on any other party. And as a result of some of these properties, I'm guessing that is why these particular things, these cryptocurrencies, have managed to accrue some value. And you can go and check online. You can actually put a dollar price on them because there are marketplaces in order to be able to trade them. So I think last time I checked, Bitcoin was around 30,000 euros, and the Ether, which is the cryptocurrency of the Ethereum blockchain that I'll talk about in a bit more depth later, that I think is now priced at 1,800 euros or something like that, or dollars, I can't remember which. So they've managed to accrue value in the same way that an otherwise fairly useless metal like gold has over time too. The big difference is that cryptocurrencies have done this in the space of a mere 10 years, whereas gold has taken hundreds of years in order to get its status as a store of value. In some ways, that's a good thing. It's nice for things to move fast. In some ways, it's a bad thing because it's always good to have some trust and some history behind your store of value. Because in a sense, these stores of value are a form of social delusion. It's a belief by all the people involved that this thing really is valuable. And it's important for that delusion to be maintained. If you've got a collapse in confidence and people don't trust a particular currency anymore, well, that is disastrous for the country that uses that currency. And we've seen that occur in different periods in history in different countries. It causes a lot of hardship. And when you think about this, this is bizarre that people end up leading very, very hard, tough lives purely because a social delusion has broken down. But that's the way it is. We've had this kind of situation for a long, long time. It's the way we function. Now, why we want to function that way, there are, of course, a lot of upsides to being able to transact with each other. It's money, and also another thing, namely companies, limited liability companies in particular, offer a great mechanism for getting people to actually work together to achieve stuff. If you go back in history, the method before that was basically through dictatorships. So yes, people can group together and do amazing things like build the pyramids without petrol-powered machinery, but they do so because they are effectively being dominated by a dictator, in the case of ancient Egypt, the pharaoh, which to us, if you have a belief in a certain level of individual freedom, is not a desirable state of affairs. Another thing is the potential for making gains or rewards is something that promotes innovation. And this is something that I believe very strongly. This is one of the reasons why I spent time on inventing and patents. Ultimately, the drive, of course, is to get some kind of compensation and some kind of recognition for what you're doing. The only other mechanism I can think of that drives innovation as powerfully as a monetary system is war. But I think most of us would agree that relying on conflict and bloodshed in order to advance our technologies is not really a desirable state of affairs. Anyway, I've gone on quite a bit about value, and the reason why is I think it's important to understand what it is and how it accrues in things, and therefore why these cryptocurrencies have become valuable. Because then you can take the next step, which is to say, well, what is this Web 3.0 going to do with it? And what we have now is we have a decentralized store of value that we can transfer value from one person to another with, and it doesn't rely on a gatekeeper. It doesn't rely on a bank or a payment processor. The hurdles in order to be able to use it are much, much lower. So an ordinary person like myself or the guy who lives down the road from me can actually now start transacting, which is something that was just not possible 10 years ago. The current traditional way to do it is to go and sign up with a payment processor like Stripe or Klarna or something like that in order to be able to get them to handle your payments for you. But as I said, there are two problems there. One is there are commissions. So you have to pay for the privilege, although it must be noted that you pay for the privilege to use cryptocurrencies as well. In the latter case, the payments go to the network as a whole rather than a particular corporation. And the second thing is the resistance to censorship. So if your payment processor suddenly decides, or your bank suddenly decides that you're not a desirable customer anymore, they can just shut you down and you're locked out. Now, there are, of course, downsides to this level of freedom in that we saw, for example, in the early days, I don't know if some of you read that in the news, there was a dark web, a website that sprang up called Silk Road, which used the potential that cryptocurrencies gave in order to transact for illegal services. So the opportunity to buy drugs or even order hits on people. However, as it turns out, cryptocurrencies are not as anonymous as the founders of Silk Road thought it would be, and they were eventually tracked down and arrested. So in a sense, progress is being made there too. And actually this has some parallels with the early web, because the first use cases that really took off in the World Wide Web were things such as gambling and pornography. Now they make up a much, much smaller proportion of what the web is used for than they did back in the early days. Actually, I knew a couple of guys in Cambridge who got started on producing web servers precisely because they wanted to serve up dodgy pictures from their dorm rooms. I must look up how they're doing these days. But anyway, that aside, so back to the web stuff. So now you've got a system that allows you to organize transactions, and this means that we are on the verge of seeing a new flurry of what people can do with the web. Web 2.0 and things like, for example, the cloud and stuff mean that whereas before you needed to have an awful lot of skill and an awful lot of knowledge and resources in order to run a website, now anybody can do it. It's fairly affordable to pay a cloud provider to spin up a web server for you, and it's there almost instantly. There are tools like WordPress that allow people who don't know about HTML and Ajax and all the other things that are needed in order to have a dynamic website running that allow them to do that kind of thing. It's just this final payment thing that has been a bit of a stumbling block. And it's important to be able to pay each other. An example I'm thinking of here for a case here is if you set up a website with a camera pointing at something. So one of the first cases of this was the Trojan Room coffee pot in Cambridge. They set up a webcam so you didn't have to get up from your desk to see if there was a fresh pot of coffee available or not. And nowadays, if like last week, I went on a long journey and I could actually go and check online whether the roadworks that were 200 kilometers from my house might actually pose a significant delay or not. But the issue there is that if I point a webcam out of my window and set up a web service so that you can see what the traffic is like outside my house, if it becomes immensely popular, then I start having to pay an awful lot for the bandwidth that it's using. And how am I going to cover that? This has happened to a lot of hobby sites. Some of them just shut down, and others end up trying to make money in order to keep the service running through advertising. So you end up with websites with lurid web advert banners encouraging you to learn how to play poker or something like that. And a lot of people would be quite happy just to pay a little bit in order to be able to use that service. But there isn't a convenient mechanism for doing this. So we're seeing in the blockchain world that Micropayments is one area that people are focusing on. In Bitcoin, for example, Bitcoin itself is very expensive to transact with, but there's something called the Lightning Network that's being built alongside it that is using Bitcoin as a sort of settlement layer. And then the Lightning Network allows you to handle thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions of micropayments, which could enable exactly the kind of service that I'm talking about. So now that I've sort of talked a bit about value and transactions, and hopefully convinced you that this is a significant advance in what we are able to do. The fact is that we're still at the very beginning, and I'm not really a futurist. I try to live by the maxim that predictions are very hard to make, especially predictions about the future. But what I can talk a bit now is some of the practical things that are actually available for you to use in order to start building things that are Web 3.0, Internet of Value like. And the thing that I want to talk about now is Ethereum, which was the sort of second major blockchain after Bitcoin that came about, where a chap called Vitalik Buterin and some of his friends thought that it would be really cool if you had Bitcoin and a proper programming language on a blockchain, so that you didn't just have these cryptocurrencies or tokens of value on the blockchain, but you had a programmatic method whereby you can manipulate them. And that's what they came up with. They called it Ethereum, and it's again, it's hit the news on and off quite a bit over the last few years. But this is still back-end stuff. This is still writing code on a blockchain, and maybe you can do something like you can instantiate the equivalent of a digital car wash token yourself. Or another case that's come up recently is the popularity of non-fungible tokens, making a unique token that has a clearly identifiable owner, and that person can then transfer it on, and the token represents something else. It might represent something in the real world, like a piece of art, might represent something in the digital world off the blockchain, like an item in a game, or it could even represent something on the blockchain itself, just be itself, for whatever purpose you want to use it. But these are all back-end things, and I really do need to get back to Web 3.0. And what we have at the moment are a number of building blocks and tools that we can use. The first one is a library that you can import into your web pages. It's written up in JavaScript. There's also a Python version of it called web3.js for the JavaScript one. And that allows you to write web pages that hook in to these public blockchains. So they give you the functionality to check for balances, to authorize transactions and stuff like that. So that means you can start building web pages which are effectively user interfaces for people to your application that can start doing all these financial things. So if you wanted to, for example, produce your own eBay, where you're going to allow people to create user accounts and sell stuff in their house that they no longer want, you can handle the payments through a cryptocurrency and through a blockchain by using one of these HTML libraries. And the tools are improving all the time. You still need to be a bit of a developer at the moment to use them, but I have no doubt that in 3 to 5 years' time, there'll be WordPress-like things that make that kind of stuff accessible to everybody. And then a second thing you need is the people who are using their web browsers to actually have a wallet, because they need to be able to authorize the spending or holding on to of their assets. And there are a whole bunch of them out there. The one that I tend to use is called MetaMask, and it's just a browser plugin. You install it into your browser, and when you go to one of these Web 3.0 sites, a little dialog pops up that allows you to connect your wallet to that site, and now you can start interacting with whatever it is that the developer has provided. And you click buttons to agree to pay for stuff or do stuff, and then the web page acts as a proxy to hand that through to the back-end blockchain, and the financial system just runs. So that really, in a nutshell, is where we are with Web 3.0. We've got all the building blocks. They're being made more and more accessible. Now it's more a question of what ideas can people come up with. And the great thing here is that whereas at the moment, if you try to build a conventional version of these things, you end up needing a big company that's managed to get all the required licenses and has a big HR department and a legal department and a C-suite of executives who get handsomely compensated for doing God knows what. these things can be put together by 2 or 3 guys in their basement, and then they subsequently go on to become cryptocurrency millionaires. But so it's a shift from the way that things used to be done to a new way. And I, for one, am extremely excited to see where this goes and what amazing things people are going to come up with. I think, am I kind of getting to the end of my time? Yep.
Yes, here. Maybe
Right.
share,
Or have I?
your takeaway, what you really want us to take away, and then we open up the questions to the
Right.
audience.
Okay. It's just I can't see my clock in the light here. I don't know how many more minutes I have. I think that was pretty much it, wasn't it? 40 minutes?
Yeah, 1 more minute.
Okay,
You go.
well, one final minute then. Okay, well, I think I've really said what I wanted to say. So probably the best thing is just to offer people the chance to ask me some questions. But I hope you guys found it interesting, and yeah, please open up the floor.
Yes, that's amazing. I have the first introduction question, which is here. What was the biggest misconception you had yourself about the Internet of Value? What were wrong assumptions you placed over the past years that turned out to be wrong?
Well, the biggest one about Web 3.0 is that I made the same mistake I did with Web 1.0, is that I couldn't see the point of it. I was actually quite late coming to Ethereum, which is the sort of most active blockchain for Web 3.0. They have the most tools, and it kind of is leading the way as to what can be done. So when I first saw it in 2015, I just went back to Bitcoin. And there you're writing sort of back-end stuff yourself in order to move the cryptocurrency around, whereas Ethereum had all this front-end stuff. So I'd say that was my biggest mistake with Web 3.0, was not picking up until 2017 or 18 that this was actually going to be significant. Also, I had this sort of feeling that I could see the point of cryptocurrencies as stores of values and transacting when you had all the DeFi stuff taking off in Web 3.0 with exchanges and borrowing and lending and stuff like that. It kind of felt like a rather funny version of Monopoly that was being played online. And again, it took me a while to cotton on to the fact that actually our conventional marketplaces, our trading, are sort of funny games that we play as well. If you look at, for example, trading in commodity futures for commodities, they have sense, they make sense for farmers who want to guarantee that they're going to have a steady income so they can keep operating their business. But most of the trading that is going on with regard to options and futures for commodities such as orange juice or pork bellies or whatever it is that's being traded on the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, those traders actually don't care about the underlying asset. They're looking at the market and they're trying to make a profit from that. And that's precisely what's happening in DeFi as well, that people are playing a financial game. And once the penny dropped and I realized that, hey, this is actually the same as what's happening in conventional finance, then I started paying attention. But it took me a while to come to that conclusion. So I think that's the answer to the question. That's the biggest thing that misconception I had about Web 3.0 at the beginning.
What's going to happen if people don't start to educate themselves about blockchain? What would be like, drawbacks in their everyday lives in the next few years?
I don't think it's going to be a drawback in the next few years. I think everything will still go along fine. It would be like not paying any attention to the World Wide Web and all these funny URLs that started appearing on buses, or deciding that you will still go to your supermarket rather than order online. I think it'll all still function perfectly fine for the next 5 or 10 years for those kind of people. It's just that I think it's going to get more and more pervasive until eventually you're going to be excluded from a large proportion of human activity. In the same way that if, there are people who say, well, I just want to have nothing to do with the web, or I don't want to have anything to do with social media. And actually in the latter case, I can respect that, because social media has not shown itself to be a paragon of virtue and something to look up to. But I just think as time goes on, not participating and understanding what is going on in the blockchain space and this financial revolution that we are experiencing is going to be akin to any other revolution that has happened in the past. You could stick with horses for an awfully long time before the automobile became essential and horses became effectively a hobby. So for now, not a problem. Later on, well, probably by the time that it matters, those kind of people will be well, I don't know whether they'll be relatively old. I think for most people, it's just going to happen. It'll just creep into their life.
Okay, great, thanks. We have a question that was upvoted by a few participants. It's about the decentralized environment. The question is, can the real world be completely shifted to a decentralized environment through the blockchain? What, or will that not be the threat to big corporate governments and so on?
Can the world be shifted? Well, some things, I guess, are always going to be centralized. You know, we even the most open democratic country in the world still tends to use representatives rather than everybody casting their votes on everything, because for a lot of us, we don't have time to sit and understand every nuance of every issue to come to the conclusions that fit our worldview the best. So in that sense, there is delegation, I suppose. I can't see this kind of mad libertarian, completely decentralized, everybody and everything does what they want. You know, there are some sort of maximalists in the decentralization space whose response to everything is decentralized. I tend to pick and choose from all the different sort of political perspectives that you can take. And I think a lot of these systems are fairly ingrained in us, so they will take a long time to go if they are fundamentally flawed anyway. And in some cases, I think centralization does make sense. You know, a blockchain is not the solution to everything. But I think that as our worldview shifts, more use cases will open up. So things, I've noticed this in the permissioned block space, chain space, for example. People who I was talking to on LinkedIn in 2016, 2017, who were working in a corporate environment and were very strongly pushing the permissioned blockchain approach, have now actually opened up to the idea that maybe a more permissionless system and a more open and a more decentralized system, therefore, might actually bring more value. So it's a kind of case-to-case thing. And I think it takes a while for people's worldviews to shift in order to be able to incorporate it and make sense of it. Because of course, if you just blanket apply it to anything, you can end up with some pretty bizarre results.
Okay, we have one more follow-up question regarding that, and then we get to Anchor's questions and Arsam's questions. So the follow-up question is, how will Web 3.0 eliminate centralized portals like Airbnb, Booking.com, Expedia? What's your view on that?
Oh, well, there's two issues there really. Well, one is getting the technology to a state where it's usable and reliable. So the user experience is pretty horrible, but it's being worked on all the time. And I mean, it's just miles better than it was a year or two ago in terms of actually being able to get to grips with it. So as time goes on, the opportunity for people to set up these competitors will become more real. The second issue is one of market awareness, which is something I've been thinking about in the last few days, which is that just because you have a solution that eliminates a gatekeeper party and makes the system easier to use or cheaper to use or more trustworthy to use, doesn't mean that people will go for it. An example I can think of here is I've talked to my daughter about how TikTok gathers masses of information about you, and maybe when you're a teenager putting your videos on there, you don't want to be you'll wake up one day and you'll be 30 and you'll wish you hadn't done that, but she doesn't care, you know, because she's a teenager. So I think with some of these things, people who are working in this space care passionately about it and want to have that option. A lot of people don't, and they go for convenience rather than owning your own data or censorship resistance and knowing that you'll be able to spend your money regardless of what some other controlling party wants to impose on you. Example I can give here is bank cards. I don't know how many of you have had the experience that I have on a regular basis, which is I have a number of different credit cards and bank account cards because I never know which one's going to work. In fact, just yesterday, I was buying some game coins for some Roblox game for one of my sons. For I don't know why, but my Finnish bank card, even though I typed in the right codes and used the code app correctly, and I have a balance there, it refused to pay for it. And I had to switch to my other bank, which was my Revolut card that worked in the end. Whereas the first one that didn't work was Nordea. That's the Finnish bank that I use. But I have about 4 bank accounts, solely because of the number of times that I found myself stuck, not being able to spend money that is ostensibly mine because of a system fault, or because the payment processor has erroneously determined that I'm in Egypt when I'm actually in Finland or something like that. So for people who have those kind of concerns, yes, these are going to be great alternatives. But for people who are just happy with the system as it is for now, they might not have the incentive to switch. But I think over time, as benefits become more and more apparent, there will be a move towards it. It just is not going to happen overnight. And it's going to happen in the areas where it's most relevant initially. Anyway, that would be my take on that.
Thanks. We have a question from Anchor, who actually says, thank you, Keir, for that insightful session and for the amazing forest view. A few other participants had said that too. He had a question regarding the gas fees that you mentioned earlier. Could you please elaborate on how the gas fees get distributed to the network as a whole? And following up on that, as in how does that process work and how is the cumulated fees consumed?
Okay, so that's quite a technical one, but I'll try and keep it simple. So in order to incentivize parties to keep this decentralized financial network running, there are transaction fees in Bitcoin, and in Ethereum, there are sort of parallel called gas fees, which are a kind of a transaction fee as well. They also serve another purpose, which gets very technical, which is, well, I'll just say it, to ensure that Turing-complete programs do not get caught in never-ending loops. But for most people, that's irrelevant. It's just a transaction fee that you have to pay in order for your transaction to be processed. And of course, this is what you have with the credit card companies. Now, we don't, as consumers, normally see that because they charge the merchants. So if a merchant accepts your credit card, they're paying 2.5% or something like that to the credit card company for the privilege of being able to get the money through the credit card system. And of course, ultimately, we as consumers pay that because the merchants will then pass that cost on to us. It's just that we don't see it. I guess it's a bit like sales tax in the US versus sales tax in Finland. For those of you in Europe, when you go and buy something, there is ALV or VAT, and it's there on the receipt, but the prices in the shop are listed as the complete cost, cost of the goods plus the tax. I was really stunned the first time I went to America that they don't do that. You take something off the shelf and it says it's $1.10. And when you get to the cash register, they charge you $1.21 because there's a sales tax. And that can lead to some awkward situations where you don't have enough cash on you. So the transaction fees are a bit like a sales tax that is paid to the people who are running the network in order to encourage them, incentivize them to continue running it. And there have been some problems with that recently in Ethereum because that sales tax went incredibly high and made transacting very, very expensive. Similarly, Bitcoin's had problems where that transaction fee has been as high as like $20 a transaction. So no use trying to buy a coffee with Bitcoin using the Bitcoin main network if you're going to end up paying $20 for the privilege of using it. But as I said, that stuff's being worked on by side chains and layer 2 solutions. These are the things that get bandied around. So it's a recognized problem. People are working on solutions. As for where those transaction fees go, well, it depends on the blockchain. But on Bitcoin, they go to the miners, the computers that are running away, adding block after block to the network in a form of a lottery. And in Ethereum, yeah, they go to the miners too at the moment, because Ethereum still has miners. I imagine that some point in the future, when they switch to a proof of stake, i.e. you don't have this work that's being done in order to extend the blockchain, it'll go to the particular account of the particular verifier. But they kind of filter their way back into the system in the same way that in a sort of tax-like manner. Does that answer the question?
Yes, thank you. We will also get into more details, such as how do networks work and so on during the next couple of weeks. So thanks for the good teaser. So one more question regarding the sources for academic resources. Artyom asked, could you recommend a couple of your favorite academic resources you are reading for your own crypto research?
I don't have a particular book that I would say go to. Well, I do. This one, of course, but I tend to go for articles. Because what I like about articles is if I have a specific issue or question, then if you can find a good article on Medium, there's some good academic papers on ResearchGate or academia.com. You know, just news groups, things like that. I don't have a sort of big, large textbook that I turn to dig these things up, mainly because I find searching online is the quickest way to drill down to the particular thing that I want to read about. And the other advantage of searching the web for this stuff is it throws up lots of different links, so you can immediately start seeing different views. Because I think it's, even if you disagree with what some people are saying about blockchain and cryptocurrencies, I think it's important to understand what it is that they're thinking and the things that are bothering them at the moment, partially to be able to address them, but also partially to try and keep a balanced view of what's going on. So that's not so much for the technical side of things, that's for the sort of social and economic side of things.
Yes, thanks very much. We also designed Unit Masters in a way that we use the internet to search for things. There's no right or wrong, but you should just look at different resources and different opinions and then draw your own conclusion towards that. So
that's a really good. I just think that's the best approach. You know, and then you just have to make sure you don't get sucked down a rabbit hole where you go down a particular path and you know, start ending in an echo chamber where you're only seeing one particular viewpoint. Because that is one of the fascinating things about blockchain and cryptocurrencies, is there are a bewildering range of opinions and characters who are involved in this. Some of whom, when you first come across them, you're going to think, well, they have completely out there viewpoints, and other ones where you think, gosh, these people are really conservative and stuck in the mud. So you've got all sorts in this space. It really is. It's fascinating just from a you know, sort of the cast of actors that are involved. I mean, I'm sure that in 10 years' time they're going to make fantastic movies about this kind of stuff.
Okay, thanks. We typically end Unit Master speaker sessions with the question, what was your happiest moment along your journey so far, Keir?
In my life in general, or in blockchain and cryptocurrency?
Yeah, whatever you feel about sharing.
I honestly can't say there's one particular event that jumps out. I mean, I'm sure what people are hoping to hear from me is, you know, the time when I suddenly realized that the vast sum of bitcoins that I had in my wallet and had forgotten the password to suddenly became unlocked and I became immensely wealthy. There's no story like that in my life. It's just been an ongoing, interesting journey of discovery, and you know, it's not been like climbing Mount Everest or anything like that. I'd say today, you know, every day when I wake up, I'm excited to see what people have come up with now and what viewpoints there are and how things have progressed, and you know, how, because this is what got me into blockchain from the very beginning. It was actually the technical side of things, reading Nakamoto's paper, which is a masterpiece. I mean, it's 8 pages long. You know, it reminds me of Einstein's paper on relativity, which was also incredibly short. And it shows you that you can come up with a revolutionary idea that changes the way that we view the world in a matter of pages. And in fact, any academics in the audience should pay note to this, because this is one of the problems I have with academia, even though I did start off there, is the sheer volume of stuff that is being produced that is full of words and sounds and signifies very little, if anything. You know, it's worth going and having a look at Nakamoto's short paper published in 2008, Bitcoin, a peer-to-peer electronic hash. You can read it in half an hour. Understanding it, on the other hand, that's a decade. Okay.
Amazing. Thanks a lot. So thank you everyone for joining us. We have our informal networking session now in